Hello.
Hello. So we will be talking today about future evolution, which is a topic you've written about quite a lot, and I've written about a little bit. Um, I want to focus on that kind of wrinkle of the AI risk discourse in particular, both because I think it's been relatively neglected and because I think it's important.
Okay, so the future will probably evolve. Are we
That's
okay
true.
with that?
Yeah, that's the most general kind of way of putting it. One way of looking at it is that like certain aspects of future evolution that regardless of whether they're like desirable or undesirable in some objective sense or something like that, incumbent actors might not like. For those to happen, it seems more likely to happen if there's no world government, no strong multilateral coordination. So does that seem right to you, or should I?
We are currently in a competitive world where nobody's in charge exactly. And so the net effect of what happens is the result of many decentralized actions, many of which can be seen as competitive or in competition with each other. That's in business and in nations and in families and in biology. We're living in a competitive world. And so that, if it continues, would set how the future changes and the ways it would change and the kinds of changes are likely to occur. And if we were to instead have some degree of global coordination, then that could change what the future becomes, depending on what that global coordination tries to do and whether it succeeds at its efforts.
Okay. And I guess we might break global coordination down into more top-down forms that would be more like a nation-state government, but just over the whole world, and more decentralized forms that would be more like, I guess there's a variety of models, but like a hunter-gatherer tribe maybe, or like some of the stuff Eleanor Ostrom talks about in Governing the Commons.
I think the most plausible thing could be just some sort of global norms such that people are reluctant to violate the global norms for fear of being, meeting disapproval or local sanction. That doesn't require any official central organization to implement. And arguably, we are having more of that in the last half century or so, global norms with global norm enforcement. It has limited things it can do, of course, compared to, say, a more formal governance, but it also has fewer things that can go wrong with it.
Okay. So is this your world forager elite idea, basically?
Yes, right. The idea that the world elites at least have come together into some sort of shared community whereby they want to be respected in that community and want to do things that won't meet with disapproval with others in the community. And that's been a reason why when there are big things like the pandemic, elites get together, they discuss what they think should be done. Then once they seem to all agree, they all go off and do it. And each going along with the global consensus in substantial part in order to gain the respect of and not get the disapproval of the rest of the global elite.
Okay, so I think this is a very interesting idea, but I have some questions about it. So first, just to see if I understand correctly, the idea is something like one would normally assume there's a collective action problem between states in banning new technologies. Like even if we might like to ban it, we're worried that other countries won't ban it and we'll lose out to them militarily or economically. And this argument would predict that like new technologies don't tend to get banned, at least not across the board. But it seems like a lot of economically or militarily advantageous new technologies have in effect been banned, like nuclear power or significantly suppressed. And it seems like your solution to this puzzle is that the decision makers in some country, say Chile, do not necessarily see Chile as the relevant entity to which the costs and benefits apply. Rather, they think of the whole global community, and they don't see a reason to undermine the entity that they're really worried about, which is the global community, by defecting against these norms to help some smaller entity that they're less worried about, such as Chile. Is that basically right?
Well, when the elites get together, they will talk in terms of what's good for the world,
Okay.
but each elite will be primarily focused on their personal outcomes.
Okay.
And that they want is status and respect in that elite world community. So they could gain status by offering arguments that the world community approved of and praised. They could gain disapproval by saying things the world community disapproved of. And they could also gain or lose approval by implementing policy in, say, Chile, that the world community either approves or disapproves of. And they may care less about the world's outcome and more about their own personal standing and status in that world community.
Okay, that makes sense. So, I guess like in IR, there's this traditional way of looking at it that nation states are unitary actors, and that there's no authority on top of nation states. And you might frame the world forger elite idea in terms of saying, well, the real unitary actor is the community of elites, or you might say there's no unitary actors, there's just individuals, and what the individuals want has moved from being like a claim or something like that within their own nation to status within the global elite. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're thinking of this in terms of an equilibrium rather than a single actor. The world, it talks in some sense as it's a single actor. Then when people go up on stage, say at an elite conference, they will talk in terms of this is what we need to do to achieve our shared goals. And those will sound a lot like the musings of an actor talking to itself about what it should do. But there isn't the single actor at the world level. There is the many individuals who are trying to gain and not lose status in this world community. In part, they can do that via offering persuasive or praised arguments on the world stage and going along with what the world agrees with.
Okay. But then the change over time that you're identifying is something like the individual actors switch from trying to maximize their own interests within a community that's confined to a certain state or maybe a certain block to a community that doesn't include everyone, but a kind of elite community that has no geographic limitation.
Well, just to be clear, previously they were playing the same game, but at smaller scales.
Right.
So if you're in a company, you're going to gain status in the company by arguing for what the company should do and what will be in the interest of the company. And the words you will hear in the company will be about what's good for the company and what should we do. And then the company will make choices, but each person in the company is primarily trying to be respected by other people there and to seem to be going along with whatever consensus is formed there. And the same is for nations and government agencies, et cetera. It's the same structure of the game. It's a matter of what the unit size of the community is.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I understand that. I guess like a question I would have about this is it really true that over the past 100 or so years, I think you've mentioned that time frame, but correct me if I'm wrong, the change has been in this direction? So like World War I, for example, was fought largely between the grandchildren of Queen Victoria. So that would seem like, I mean, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping are at least not related to each other. Like it's not an entirely new development, at least, right?
Well, so there have been larger communities before. It's about a relative weighting. So,
okay.
I mean, even today, there are definitely people who are talking as if they're trying to promote a particular country or even a particular firm.
Okay.
And often their loyalties are somewhat divided. That is, a person in a firm will talk about how to promote that firm, and then they will go on the stage at Davos and talk about how to promote the world.
Right.
And their words may be a mixture of motives here in terms of when they're trying to promote their firm and when they're trying to promote the world. And of course, they will often be trying to simultaneously to achieve multiple purposes. Say, help their firm by convincing the world that the world is better off if their firm gets advantages.
Okay.
So it's about sort of the units of the communities and sort of their relative loyalties. In some sense, there have always been people who've tried to talk about what's good for the world. They've just been weaker in their voice, and but the point is, 2 centuries ago, say, we were much more in a world why the main conversations were, say, within a nation or even within a family of a nation, and people were more overtly arguing about what to do to benefit those things. And now, because we have this elite community that's worldwide, there is more of a discussion in that community about what's good for the world. And those people more argue in those terms.
Okay.
And they will even more act in those terms in the sense of trying to look good in that world community. So obviously, you know, if you're in Chile and you're in head of the pandemic policy, you both want to do something that will look good for your Davos friends when you talk to them about what's good for the world, but you'll also want your bosses in Chile to approve of what you're doing and saying that's good for Chile. And then you want your political party and your allies to be thinking that what you're doing is good for them. And even your family, you want to tell them having this job and getting this respect is good for your family. So when people are generally trying to have it all, they're trying to gain, you know, promote and gain the allegiance of multiple communities, but the relative weight they put on those communities have changed over time.
Okay. And I guess, so there seem to be like a couple elements of a community in the relevant sense. So one is just awareness that the other parties exist and some kind of like caring to some degree what's happening with them. Another part that's related might be a kind of like sociological connection, like, I don't know, like a family relationship, or you all went to the same school, or yeah, some connection at the level of habits or personal knowledge of each other or things like that. And then another level is like a kind of, in terms of rhetoric, do you talk about the world's community, and are your speeches like, is the thing you're arguing for ostensibly the good of the world community? Because you could have the first two without the third one, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so I guess like in terms of the historical change you identify, I guess like which of these, except for the first one, which is for sure a necessary condition, which of these do you see as changing more in recent history? And which sort of motivates the theory more? Like, is it more that like the whole world, like the leaders of all kinds of countries went to Harvard, or is it more like people actually talk in these terms at Davos?
I would think the central driving force is who vouches for you or who praises you or who counts for evaluating you. Okay. Such that you want those people to speak well of you, and you're trying to curry their favor and impress them so that they will speak well of you, or who, if they spoke ill of you, could tank your position or career. Okay. That community of who might speak of you will be a community that talks to each other.
Right,
so,
that makes sense.
So it's a question of who's talking to each other the most, and who's then in those conversations forming these shared impressions of who's good and who's bad, such that when somebody says, who should I hire for the head of Chile pandemic response? Once upon a time, your question might be entirely assumed, well, I should be asking Chile elites, Chilean government elites about who should be good for this post. And that would be, and I would be listening to conversations of those people when they talk to each other, and I would go to a meeting of those people and I would ask them who's good for this, or I would say, I'm thinking of this person, what do you think? And they would have an opinion about it. That's the main driving force, is who evaluates you, who is talking about you and setting the evaluations of you such that that will set your career. And when different groups of people talk, that creates different communities of people that create shared impressions such that you want to impress those people.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess like, but with the historical change element to it, it seems like the world has become less this way in some ways, even as it has become more this way in others. And I guess the dynastic example, like it really did used to be the case that the leaders of many European countries had been talking to each other throughout their entire lives. Or am I missing something that's not really so relevant?
But they didn't hire each other that way, right?
Yeah, I guess not.
So when you're appointing someone to a high-level United Kingdom post, you didn't go into your royal network of royal friends and pick somebody out of Italy to put in that post.
Yeah, I guess that would be a weird move. I mean, right. There was some stuff a bit like that. Like, I think after Greece got independence, like the monarchs of Europe decided to have a Danish prince become king of Greece.
Okay,
But
but that's still about who's king, maybe, and not about who's heading the various government agencies.
yeah, that's not like finance minister of Greece.
Right.
Yeah. And so is there like I mean, maybe this historical point doesn't matter too much, and we should just move on and say there's some kind of long-term trend in this direction. It doesn't matter if it happened 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So like, feel free to say that. But why is king so different? Is it because like is it because like there's no question of who will be appointed to king, so there's no point of trying to like build up your resume to become king?
I'm reading a book called Peasants into Frenchmen.
Okay.
About rural France, and in that context, you can have a local mayor or a local town leader that the town trusts as loyal to the town, and then there could be representatives of royalty from far away that townspeople don't trust because they don't represent us, and they're more seen as a conquering army that's imposed their will rather than us. And in many ways, royalty was seen like that way for many centuries. That is, sure, royalty intermarried, and therefore you couldn't necessarily trust royalty to be so loyal to our country. But that's why you filled the top posts of agencies, not with royalty, but with local ministers who were part of the local elite community. And you trusted those to care about our nation, and you didn't so much trust the royalty.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you might see like the trend away from, I mean, not just the trend away from monarchy, but the trend from absolute to constitutional monarchy kind of in those terms. Like the king, like, whatever, like maybe the king of England actually like prefers to speak German and is from Hanover, but the minister of the exchequer is going to be an English person, and the war minister is going to be an English person, and so on.
It does seem like the trend to think about is that in the last half century, the leaders of various government agencies tend more to be selected from those who are spoken well of in an international community of expertise.
Yeah.
And their policies are spoken well of or not by reference to that international discussion.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there are earlier examples of things like that, maybe like prohibition, which there was I have a list here. It's like Canada, sure, various small Nordic countries, Russia, Hungary, right, Finland, and the United States all had prohibition. And I don't really know the details of this, but presumably it's not a coincidence. They were presumably talking to each other about it at the time.
Right. So people, I think, saw that as less of a national conflict. They didn't see how if we deviated from international prohibition norms, that we could get some advantage over our neighbors. Yeah,
that's
right.
It probably would have been the other way. Like if we have prohibition, we can get an advantage over our neighbors. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so I guess moving on from the world forager elite in particular, we might think one of the features that determines how much evolution there will be in the future, as opposed to paths that somebody chose, is how easy or hard multilateral coordination is. Does that make sense? Or
sure.
Yeah.
But there are many kinds of coordination. We should think about how each of them will have advantages and disadvantages, but sure, there's a general category. Now, this world forager elite or this global community, it still allows evolution. That is,
can you say a bit more about that?
Well, please? That is, people can offer, innovative policy proposals that could gain attention at the world stage, and then they could gain an advantage from that. People could innovate in how they report on each other and what coalitions they have and who praises each other, and they can innovate in how well they show or hide their local deviations from the global consensus.
Yeah. So it would seem like if you have this world forager elite type regime, that would close off a lot of trajectories that might otherwise be open. Does that,
they could just disapprove of some changes, right? So they could identify some changes, the whole world goes, we don't like that. And if we find anybody doing that, we're going to punish them. And then they could just shut down certain categories of changes.
Right.
Through that. Now it needs to be simple enough that they can notice it if a violation, and be able to define border cases and say what it is or not, and maintain the attitude that it's disapproved. But it certainly does look like a way to reduce change, if not eliminate it.
Or to, at least to reduce the scope, like reduce the set of changes that might actually happen. I guess I don't know if it reduces the total change between the beginning and the end. Maybe it does that.
But it might just slow the rate of some kinds of change, but not prevent them eventually.
Yeah, that's also true. And I do agree with this point that like there's going to be inevitably there's going to be a lot of change in the future. So the questions that are relevant are about rate or what directions does it go in versus not go in, or how much or how little not, like yes or no, is there change? Yeah, but so you mentioned different kinds of coordination. Can you say a bit more about that?
Oh, well, we could have this global community, which is one kind of coordination. Then we could have a formal world government, world king, a world parliament, which would have direct and formal powers. And at the moment, we have a lot of multilateral organizations, which typically have people from around the world meeting together and issuing statements together and somewhat pressuring locals to do things, but they usually have pretty weak formal rules. And that's the median international coordination today.
Yeah. And in particular, those things almost never have the ability to actually use force to make parties comply with their rules.
Because at least at the moment, most citizens of most nations get very upset if they hear that they've signed away their sovereignty by giving powers to these international organizations. And so they prefer to get their influence more in softer ways.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like I don't have a great word for this, but it seems like there are some forms of coordination that are not exactly just based on norms as opposed to rules, and are not exactly a government per se. I mean, like, you know, the book Governing the Commons? I presumably you do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's an example in that book of this Turkish fishing village called Alanya, where it was a problem in this place that people were fishing too much. So they came up with a set of rules where the fishing area is divided into numbered zones, and everybody gets like a number at the beginning of the year, everyone who's allowed to fish, and they move through these places one by, like, every day you move one over. And it's set up in such a way that like you don't really need like fishing cops. The fishermen can kind of enforce it themselves within the matrix of these rules.
Right.
So I like, what would you call that?
Well, those are basically rules that are more specific, enforced by norms. So,
okay,
you know,
but also enforced by force, right?
Well, as a mixture, right? So even with law today, law is mainly enforced by norms, in the sense that we don't have a cop on every corner watching everything.
Right.
We rely on individuals to report other people violating laws and to follow a norm that they should report such things. And so usually law violations aren't reported because people nearby have decided that that's an acceptable exception, or that they don't want to enforce the norm for reporting legal violations. So even, official laws are mostly handled by norms.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. Yeah, and I guess like a little more abstractly, you might say something like, look, like, what is the definition of the police? Like, it's just, ultimately, it's going to be based on norms. Like, what is the pattern of people wearing uniforms and carrying weapons and coordinating with each other in certain ways?
So I presume we wanted to talk about the long-term future particularly. And so we might ask which of these issues are especially relevant in the long run. Right.
And one way of approaching that might be like, what are the most fundamental barriers to coordination that are not an artifact of our particular situation? Like commitment problems, I think, would be in that category.
Well, commitment problems are an issue. Visibility, of course, is another issue. Just what can you see? Right. You can't, it's harder to enforce rules about things that are hard to see.
Agreed.
And of course, it's less about who can see, but more who can see who can see. There's sort of the common knowledge visibility that often matters more.
Yeah. And I guess another issue for coordination is just like various kinds of failures of rationality. Like if you're too impulsive, but also if you just can't foresee what the product of some agreement would be, you might not sign it, even if you could foresee what would happen.
So another issue might be bright lines. So if we imagine some sort of continuum and everybody in the world sitting somewhere on that continuum, then we might imagine a norm that we don't let anybody get too far from the median, but the whole distribution could just drift over with time without limit.
Right.
So it's not a barrier to long-term change. It's so much as a barrier to how far ahead any one part could be relative to the rest.
Sorry, anyone, I didn't understand the last part of that.
So say we have an issue for lifespans, right? Immortality.
Okay.
Well, lifespan is a particular, everybody dies at a particular age. So that's how far you go. You might imagine making it illegal for people to live more than twice the median of the world. But then the median could just keep increasing.
Right.
And so it's not a limit to how far the world can go living. It might be a limit to how far any one person could be compared to others.
Yeah. Like, I mean, everybody, like, I assume the world median can't go up at more than 1 year per year, right?
For example.
Yeah. Although
So
I guess you could indefinitely stay behind that and just keep you could live forever if that was the rule.
Right. So the point is, if we ask how far could the future change, and then we ask how could coordination prevent change, then we have to not just look at ways that the world could prevent deviation from some world median or middle. We have to ask what would prevent that middle from drifting. That's
a good point. That's interesting.
So that could be like number of children per adult, or lifespan, or the size of a bomb that any one person can hold, or how artificial anyone gets in terms of how cyborgy they are compared to bio, or right. And there's just a whole bunch of parameters that people are worried about for the long run future.
Right.
But those parameters could drift arbitrarily, even with global coordination, if global coordination is just focused on preventing variation around some middle.
Yeah.
Dealing with the variations.
I mean, but if there was some absolute standard, then this might not be a problem.
Right. But the question is, how likely is it that the world would impose absolute standards rather relative to relative standards?
Okay. I guess I have no idea how likely. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so for example, in the pandemic response, once the world agreed on a particular pandemic response, most of the social pressure was imposed on deviations from the shared standard response. Or once most of the world agrees there's a certain way you should do medical experiments, then most of the pressure gets on people who are trying to do medical experiments differently.
Okay, so maybe it's like the way norm enforcement works is it's not relative, it's relative to the group, which is inherently a moving target.
Right. So for example, we have a lot of heavy regulation of nuclear energy.
Right.
Which mainly prevents people from making nuclear power plants that deviate too much from the middle of the world's regulations of nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
But if the middle could drift, then it could go a long way. So you might ask, is the world inclined to hold some absolute line regarding nuclear power plants or genetic engineering or, climate change, et cetera?
Yeah. That is interesting. I guess so. In the AI safety discourse, there's been some discussion. I think there's been a kind of like hastiness associated with this idea that AIs will have a very easy time coordinating with each other.
It's a stark hypothesis that gives stark conclusions, but maybe not be terribly believable.
You said it's maybe not terribly
not so believable, but yes, it's if you're trying to hype the risk and say, look how bad it could be, then you make that stark assumption, then you get starkly extreme outcomes.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it. But another thing, another point is just like, it seems like if AIs are really good at coordinating with each other, then they might work together against us. But if they're not so good at coordinating with each other, then maybe the future will be determined by evolution. So it's maybe you could argue there's a kind of dilemma here for people who don't want the future to evolve too much, although I haven't thought about that very much. In any case, it seems like the first step of that dialectic is often that people say like AIs can read each other's code. And they can release, like they can prove that that it's really their code. And I don't really understand why people think the second part, but even the first part I don't really buy, because like ML systems, it's pretty hard to read their code right now. And presumably they'll get more elaborate in the future.
I think the way to say it is that we have always been able to make small, transparent systems that have limited complexity. And we've always had the option to use those small systems for various purposes. And it turns out so far we just haven't thought they were that useful. But we always could. So the question is, will we come to do this more in the future? That is, huge, complicated, opaque AIs can create some small, more transparent AIs. And then those small ones could be used for some purposes. But the question is, how often would you want to use one? Because it's not going to be able to embody all the complexity and sophistication of the large, opaque ones.
Okay.
But there is going to be more things you can do with it. But that's already true today. Like at the moment, say the US and the Soviet Union could have made some computers that had some algorithms by which they monitored, nuclear missiles and did something with them, right?
So, I mean, even that is there. That's not, even that might fail in any given case, I guess. Like, so do you know about the underhanded C contest?
No.
Okay, so there used to be this contest. I don't think it exists anymore. But basically the way it worked was there would be a bunch of C programmers would get together, and there would be an ostensible goal, for instance, counting votes. And then the real goal would be to subvert the ostensible goal in some way that an expert judge reading your program will not notice.
Right.
And so one year, the prompt was, you need to have a program that takes like data that like ostensibly represents a state dismantling a nuclear warhead, and will always say, yes, this really was a nuclear warhead.
Yeah.
And the point of this kind of program would be that if a state has an obligation to dismantle a certain number of nuclear warheads, it could use this kind of program to pretend it was in compliance and thereby keep a larger nuclear arsenal. And people figured out like various ways of doing this.
Right.
And it seems like people might continue to figure out various ways of doing things like that in the future.
I mean, it is true that we can prove theorems sometimes. So there is a subset of mathematical programming where you can prove a theorem about a program. So, but that's been true for many decades now. We haven't actually used that theorem proving ability of programming to do that much in our world, but it remains a possibility, and we'll probably slowly do more of it. But the idea
why do you think it's that would take more?
Well, it's hard to get right. So there's this concept in computer security of the attack surface, right?
Okay.
That is, what are all the different ways you could try to attack something? And to make something strong, which one of the things you're trying to do is to limit the attack surface, to make there only be a small number of ways you can get at it. But in terms of real computer security, as people know, there's like some algorithm, and you could try to outwit the algorithm, but usually you get farther by calling people up and pretending to be somebody else, or sneaking in the building and grabbing a ID card, etc. Right? There's just all these different ways to get at real systems, and it's the weakest way that is the way people will get in, and you're trying to make all the ways not very weak, and the larger a service that is, the more trouble it is to just prevent all the different ways. So like one interesting hypothetical would be, we could have made peace between nations by now by having a special diplomatic school where people go to that school when they're 5 years old or something, and then they learn how to be a diplomat in that school generically at a world level without any allegiance to any one country. And then we take graduates of that school who've lived there their whole life and only ever interacted with other people at school, and then we assign them trustworthy jobs in the world of making neutral decisions between nations or something, right? Now that uses an entire person for their intelligence and ability. And all it requires is that we be able to isolate them from a young age to ensure that they don't have any particular loyalties. And we have to control their teachers to not be secretly handing off particular loyalties to them. And we don't do this.
Yeah. And what follows from the fact that we don't do this?
Well, we apparently don't trust the process of such a school being
we don't think it would work.
Right. We don't think we could neutrally pick the people who ran the school and how they were selected there and how they could be motivated when they came out. We just don't think it's possible to make a set of neutral diplomats like that.
I mean, it's also possible like that people haven't really thought of this. But I do think, yeah. So do you think it's like reasonable to weekly expect increases of in this kind of coordination tech as time goes on? Or do you think we should just be like, it could be either way?
Well, I think it's more about the relative ability of coordination tech compared to all the other tech.
Okay.
So if you just hold everything else constant and then you see coordination improving, then yeah, you're going to see improvements in coordination abilities. But what the real question is the relative improvement of ways we could coordinate versus ways we could undermine our coordination. That's just like the relative change of offense and defense in war, right?
Sure. Or
And
cybersecurity or
right,
whatever.
exactly. So it's just not obvious that there's a net change in offense versus defense over the long run in conflict. And it's not clear there's a net change in coordination versus, well, I guess the one thing is clear. In the last centuries, we have greatly increased the scale of organizations.
Yeah.
So clearly, once upon a time, it just wasn't possible to manage large organizations very well. And now it is. That's clearly a coordination win.
Yeah. Or I mean, the World Forager Elite is also, I mean, if
Right.
one accepts that model. Or like e-commerce, I think is another kind of striking example. Like, because I guess of reputation systems, or I guess I don't really know why, but
Right.
my best guess would be reputation systems. It's possible to do business with like some guy in China who you've never met before, and typically it works out.
So I guess we could still ask, okay, many kinds of coordination are increasing in scale and becoming more important. You could try to project that into a very long-term trend, but it's going to be hard to do that because there are so many different variables you could be trying to project here. This is really a space with a lot of different things going on. So what's at stake in trying to make this projection? I mean, should we just say we don't know and we'll see how far we can coordinate?
Yeah, I mean, I think often we want to say more than we don't know. Like we might say, we don't really know, but we think like it's a little more likely than not, or something like that. Or do you mean more, what is the use of this information?
Well, yeah, what are we trying to infer?
Yeah, I guess
if we had a more particular purpose for this analysis, we could target our analysis to that purpose.
So, I mean, one question that seems to be in the background with a lot of things about the long run future is like, to what extent can we choose what will happen in the long run future relative to our desires? And if it turns out that coordination is not going to be that good, then that extent is not, it's not very much how much we can choose in the long run future.
Okay, there's some other ways to think about that question, though, that maybe you should simultaneously apply. Another thing to ask is, how many legacies are there?
Okay.
So if we thought competition would basically force one very particular endpoint, regardless of where you came from, like there was just one optimal way to have a future agent, or one optimal distribution of such agents for that world, then we just predict that wherever you start, that's where you end up. And therefore, it doesn't really matter where you start or what you're trying to do in the early run. All you can really influence is maybe how long it takes to get there or something else, but there's really nothing else to influence because that's just the endpoint. So in order to have an answer different to that, you need some concept of legacy. You need some concept of how there could be different possible futures, depending on where we start, some path dependence.
Okay.
In some sense, there's no point in pushing for the long-term future unless there's some kind of path dependence.
Yeah, I agree.
If there's just one endpoint, then you give up. You go, that's
yeah,
where we're going.
Worry about more local stuff.
Right. Exactly. But if there's more than one place the long-term could go, now there's some interest in pushing it one way or the other. So then you want to start asking, what are long-term legacies? In what ways could there be multiple equilibrium in the future? Basically.
Do you know of any?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of purported candidates, for example. So standards are one, right? So I'll say language standards or complicated protocol standards. or even metric standards, currency standards, right? Or even rules of procedure standards, right? You could just have a way in which there's a lot of possibilities, and even if in some abstract sense, one of them would be best, once you've spent a long enough time with one of these standards, it's not worth switching. You might as well stick with the standard you started with. Right. And another example of standards, say city locations. It's great that everybody's together in the same place in a city. The city could have been in a different place, but once everybody's together in one place, then it's not worth moving, even if you figure out that another place would have been a better place for a city.
Okay.
Now, it could be that maybe in a big flat plain, the city can like slowly drift from one place to another. But if there's like a mountain or water in between, maybe it can't drift across that barrier and it gets stuck.
Okay.
So this is one kind of legacy. There's just a bunch of different multiple equilibrium.
So you might see legacy, like some legacies seem, so the locations of cities, a lot would have to change for the cities in the world to be in totally different places. But like the kind of music people listen to, or like things that typically change a lot, if you don't want those to change in the future, that requires more ability to coordinate. Would you agree with something like that?
Right. So some kinds of things we can see as dynamic equilibria. Multiple, that is, the equilibrium itself is so fashion we see as such a thing.
Right.
If we say fashion is this just process by which, you know, shirt hem lengths and hair lengths change over time, then that's just the equilibrium. And it might be the equilibrium we get into is this thing that intrinsically changes and has a mixed strategy in it, where it jumps around.
Right.
And that's just the equilibrium you expect. And so if you want to prevent the continuation of that dynamic equilibrium, then you'd have to find a way to knock it out of that into some other more stable equilibrium.
Okay. I guess that, yeah, so I guess it still seems to me like a big factor in determining what happens in the future, and specifically whether steps that are locally advantageous but are not desired by many other actors, like whether things like that determine the path of the future, or something else determines the path of the future, really depends a lot on whether there's a world government or some other kind of coordination. So is the legacies thing like a competing view, or is it just a list of things that might continue even if there's no world government or no global coordination? Or
certainly, global coordinations are things that can be legacies. That is, there might be many possible kinds of global coordination, and then you might prefer some to others.
Okay.
But once you have one, they might get stuck and be hard to change. But then, yes, some sort of global coordination could also, you know, influence the other aspects of the world. So, you know, we certainly see that at the moment. Say, one of the favorite topics of elites when they get together at a place like Davos is what's wrong with the world and how should we change it to fix it?
Okay.
So say social media, they say, well, social media is an equilibrium and it's clearly happening as an equilibrium, but they don't like it, and they want to want people to change it. And so they're looking for levers to change it.
Okay.
And so, you know, that can be part of the process. But of course, part of the process could also be that they have a fashion cycle inside of their world, and they'll never be happy because they'll always want to change whatever they got. So we don't know.
Sure, but they could, like, even if they're never happy, they could, you know, create a world like without social media, or with more wildlife refuges, or like whatever it is that they want.
But they have a local influence, but they might be on some sort of path through some cycle, just like,
like eventually they're going to change their mind and say, no, now like social media.
Right, exactly. Yes, right. Because
yeah, maybe. I mean, but it seems like there are enough things that if they just want to cycle through things, they don't ever have to come back to the same topic. Maybe that's a very vague thought. I don't know.
Sure, it might be a high dimensional space they cycle through, so it takes a very long time to ever get back, but you still have a sense of the distribution of the space they're going over and how you're uncertain about where they might go.
In that case, it seems like you shouldn't be so. My understanding is you're worried that these groups will ban, important future technologies, and that this will significantly curtail the human future.
Right.
But if you think, well, they just cycle through things and eventually they have to reverse themselves to keep cycling, then there's nothing to worry about, right? It's just a speed bump.
So one of the biggest worries I might have is that civilization would say we don't want to allow any interstellar colonization. Nobody leaves here.
Right.
Now, there's a sense in which, like, that's a really hard ask.
Yeah.
Because if ever anybody leaves, it's over. You lost.
I mean, unless you can chase them down somehow. Right.
Which gets increasingly hard the farther away they go and the less you know where they went. So it looks like this is a ratchet. So that would be optimistic. You could say, sure, you're going to try, but haha, you're not going to succeed. Eventually they'll sneak out.
Or you're right now you say no space colonization, like next year the fashion has to change, so everyone has to go into space or something like that, right?
Right, but you can't swap it back. But once everybody's gone out to space and you decide, oh, we need to all come back, well, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So optimistic, but in the last half century or so, we have seen again greatly reduced nuclear power, great restrictions on genetic engineering. We are currently considering substantial restrictions on artificial intelligence.
That is correct.
We have really pretty substantial restrictions on medical technology for a while. So once you get
there with medical technology,
say challenge trials and medical experiments, for example,
or like IRB type things.
Right, exactly. There's many kinds of financial regulation that have long been, banned and prohibited. So once you get away from usual practices to look for all the hypothetical things that many people have advocated, then you find more things that have just been consistently prevented for a long time. And the question of how much value you put in those things. But I consider it's more of an open question, whether or not we will be able to lock some things down indefinitely or not. I can still worry about that, but I don't have to be sure about it.
Yeah, that's kind of my own reason for worrying about the AI risk. I'm not sure it will happen, but I'm concerned. So I guess I can see that perspective. Maybe the last topic is like, it seems like a lot of this comes back to space colonization. And an important factor that will influence space colonization is what is the offense-defense balance in space? Like, or is it possible? So like, and a related question, I guess, like, is it possible to have some coordinated system across space? So do you think it's impossible, or maybe not impossible, but like very unlikely to have a coordinated system?
So the speed of light looks like an enormous fundamental limit. So if wormholes were possible, I would change my mind dramatically.
Okay, but let's say they're not.
Assuming the speed of light is a dramatic limit, then that, first of all, it sets a limit on like shooting things. You send a projectile out at something, then it moves. If they just
keep running away, then it's never going to hit them.
It's going to be hard. Yeah, it's going to be farther and farther away they are, the harder it is to have a projectile hit something. Harder it is to see and to see where it's going to go. And basically, the more growth can happen between time delay periods. So if I think of like the time period between which I could send a signal out and kind of get back to me as a time delay, the more that can happen within that time delay, the harder it is going to be controlling things at the other end of that delay process.
Yeah,
so if it's 1,000 light years and it takes 2,000 years to get back, and in 2,000 years they can like grow a whole civilization and stuff.
Yeah,
it's just looks harder and harder.
But it seems like there are possibilities. Like if you could, let's suppose we've solved aging for the sake of the argument, and also that like people can duplicate themselves. If I send basically myself out into space, it's not clear why I should be so worried about controlling. Like I don't like use my right hand to restrain my left hand.
Right, but you have a pretty short time feedback such that if the right hand were becoming a problem, you could do something about it.
Okay.
But, if your copy goes out there and evolves for 1 billion years compared to 1 billion years of your evolving here, these things could just become very different from each other.
Yeah, but like, if, as it seems you do, you entertain the possibility that things on Earth could evolve at a very slow rate, then why can't things in space also potentially evolve at a very slow rate?
So the image that is the most, plausible here in my mind is the political officer. You send
Yeah,
an
I think I've heard
expedition
this.
out into space with a political officer, and the political officer has certain priorities and powers, and the political officer stays loyal, and it has to enforce loyalty on the rest. So this is similar to what we talked about, like the transparent AI, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we can create small transparent things that are going to be very stable, and then they'll be embedded in large opaque changing things. And there's the question of how much the small transparent thing can matter relative to the large opaque changing world.
So is your view that it probably won't matter very much, or just that we have no idea?
Probably can't matter that much. That is, if you're going to send interstellar colonies out there and let them deal with a lot of unexpected stuff, you can't have the political officer be overseeing too many details about what's going on.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
you'll have to limit what the political officer's scope of power is to something pretty narrow so that you can ensure that part.
Maybe a political officer. I mean, I wonder, are there other metaphors here? Because it does seem to load the dice a little bit. So like maybe, people do various things to like control their weakness of the will, right?
Those things are often context dependent and overcome exactly because of changing context. So consider the example of, all we want is that these colonists don't come back here and contest with us.
Sure.
Okay. Go out there, do whatever you want, but don't come back and mess with us. That's our one requirement.
Like if you leave, you never come back.
Oh, and you never, but their descendants and ours will still meet somewhere in the middle. And what exactly does this rule mean about such meetings, right? Do they always have to give in whenever we meet again in the future?
So the point is, it might be hard. I'm conscious that we're running up on time, but your point is something like, it might be hard to specify in enough detail exactly this rule. Don't come back.
The more general point is, you'll have to think in this terms of the space of a set of pretty simple rules.
Yeah, I mean,
that's going to be,
it really just comes
be a lot of
back
work to figure that out. You'll be able to do something. Just, I can't see it being that much, but you'll be able to do something. What can you do to figure it out?
Maybe the reason I disagree with this is I'm a little more agnostic about whether the small transparent thing can work.
The question is, how much can it manage or control or assure you of? So just like with an AI, there's a big opaque AI sitting next to a small transparent AI. How much can you get this big? Can you trust the big opaque AI because of what it showed you about the small transparent one?
I mean, maybe a lot if the small transparent one is like threatening it with nuclear weapons or something.
So, but that's the question is like, well, you can see that the small transparent one has a nuclear weapon and it can point it in some directions, but can you tell about the opaque one how resilient it is against it? That is
okay,
right. So you'll have to show that the small transparent one has its finger on the neck of the big opaque one, such that it could destroy the big one, maybe. But if it's opaque, how do I know where the neck is and how vulnerable the neck is and things like that?
And how does the small one, like, does it actually, it was built to achieve some goal, but like, can it really tell about all the edge cases that might come up and things like this?
Or even like, it's going to take a lot of inputs just to like figure out where it is in the world and orient itself, et cetera. How many hidden inputs could we have coded in to get the outcome we want by sort of sending hidden signals to it that it has some opaque response to that we haven't figured out, because it's not completely simple,
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't think it's crazy to think the small transparent one can enforce a lot of stuff, but I also I'm just not sure.
I guess that's where we'll have to leave it for now.
Yeah, thanks very much, Robin.
It's been nice talking.